You are listening to episode 92 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Tony Bernhard speaks with us today about acultural Buddhist teaching and retreats. Hi everyone. As we've seen in the growth and popularization of Buddhism in the West, the teaching and practice takes on forms that may not fit with the cultural background from which they've come. Our commitment to Buddhism does not, as it turns out, force us into a false dichotomy of monasticism versus lay practice. We can, and many of us do, choose to engage with this moment as sentient beings rather than as people who have decided to accept a culture and religion which we have certain reservations and disagreements. To me, this is the tremendous strength of a secular approach to Buddhist teaching and practice. It's not specific to Buddhists. It's something anyone can do, even us secular types. Tony Bernhard is one of Spirit Rock's community Dharma leaders, sits on the Spirit Rock Planning Committee and on the board of the Sati Center for Buddhist Studies, leads sitting groups in Davis, and teaches in and around the Bay Area. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice rainforest mate. And our guest today is Tony Bernhard. Tony, thank you for being here.
Good to be here.
Now, I should note to people who are sounding a little confused as they're listening to this podcast that this is Tony Bernhard, the husband of Tony Bernhard, whom we've already spoken with. And so this is the Tony with a Y of that family that we're chatting with today.
Right.
Tony, what I was hoping is you could start us off by describing a bit of your background and how you first encountered meditation and Buddhist practice, and in particular how that's changed for you over the years.
Okay, well, I guess the first thing to note is that I picked up my first Buddhist book was D.T. Suzuki's Manual of Zen Buddhism in 1965. And I read that and I thought, what do you have to know to get the answers to those questions right? And so, for a lot of people who come to the Dharma through the gate of suffering, I came to it, I'm not quite sure what gate that was, but there was a challenge there that was implied in those koans, and a confidence in the teachers as they were portrayed that just intrigued me. And so I became, for a while, what Christopher Titmuss calls a Buddhologist. I read a lot of Buddhology and experimented with various practices, TM, and didn't actually get into intensive Buddhist meditation until our children had gone off to their various adult lives, and which is 20 or so years ago. And then I started a pretty intensive sequence of retreat practices. And the way you encounter the Dharma is, for me, it was through Spirit Rock, which was just a fabulous portal. I'm so appreciative of Jack and Joseph and Sharon and the people who brought the teachings from Asia and the practices. And I spent, it's now 20 plus years with them. and but also along the way, other things happen because you meditate and you hear Dharma talks, and your understanding of the Dharma sort of flows with the talks that you hear, and depends on the training and understanding of the teachers. And there's what I say these days, there's no truth in labeling in spiritual practice. Nobody comes on and says, well, what I'm about to say is 40% Buddha Dharma, 20% Christian mysticism, 20% New Age spiritualism, and whatever's left just plain bullshit. And so, I encountered, there's a lot of confusion in what is the Dharma and what isn't the Dharma. I remember spending a retreat with a sister from Burma, who an incredibly accomplished jhana practitioner, and going in to see her for an interview after the second day of the retreat, and we were doing hour-and-a-half sits, which were a bit longer than I was used to, and my body was reminding me of what it was like to sit my first retreat. And I said, gee, it's a little tough for me. I said, this isn't really my practice. And she said, oh, well, what's your practice? And I said, well, I do Vipassana insight practice. Oh, no, you don't, she said. You can't do that until you've mastered all 8 jhanas.
It's a rule. You can't until you've hit formless attainments.
Well, I was at the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies, so there was a handy library there, and I in a kind of a daze, I went over there and I looked, and God damn, if it wasn't there, I mean, that was a major thread in the tradition. It wasn't the exclusive thread, but it was there. And what was so compelling was the quality of her presence. And so I spent a couple of years, just staggering around, sitting, but staggering and saying, well, am I playing at this? What am I doing? What's going on? And she would, during one of the sessions, she gave a Dharma talk there were devas in the room, she said. And, I just didn't know what to make of that. But, she was incredibly composed. And, I've chased, the jhana, the jhanas for some years, and just because they feel so good. And I guess the biggest change in my practice came listening to John Peacock. This was about 4 years ago now, I guess, who's a British scholar with a pretty impressive academic background and as a practitioner and teacher. And he introduced me to the Nikayas sort of directly. I mean, we all refer back to the Nikayas, to the Pali Suttas. Those of us who've been trained in the Theravadan tradition, anyway. Although most of us haven't really read them all. We've sampled in the Majjhima. This was me. I actually read the whole Majjhima. I worked on a class to go through it. But, sometimes you just don't see what you're reading. And I found, I guess what the experience for me was it put awakening within reach. One of the things about the tradition is that Nibbana is some kind of transcendental thing that's out there, that's separate from. And my understanding had been, it's described as the unconditioned. And so you sort of think, well, if it's the unconditioned, it has to exist all the time and so, I struggled with metaphors. Well, maybe it's like they're like the sun, and it's just the clouds that obscure my ability to see it. There's this and then of course, when you set up something transcendental like that, you set up spiritual hierarchy. Some people have got it or seen it, and some people haven't. And Peacock suggested, well, he actually wrote an equation on the board, which really lights people up. and that is nibbana equals upekkha. And it was like hearing a gong go off, because if nibbana, if awakening is equanimity, as we translate upekkha, that means it's a process, because upekkha isn't a dazed state of mind in which you're indifferent to what happens. It's fully engaged, and it means engaging with the pleasant and the unpleasant without resisting or clinging. It's the absence of greed and aversion, desire and aversion, and it's a very different vision of the goal of practice than somehow reaching some transcendent entity and then clinging to it, which the Buddha said that he couldn't find anything that was permanent, but postulating that nibbana is the unconditioned. Now, I'm not a Pali scholar, and I forgot to study Pali when I was growing up. But you sort of pick up a little bit here and there, and some of it may be in the way that you form the negative in Pali. So, but there's a place in the and I'm not sitting with my books in front of me, but in the Samyutta Nikaya, where the Buddha says the unconditioned is that which is not conditioned by greed, hatred, and delusion, not that which is not conditioned by causes and conditions.
Yeah, anything at all. Right.
Right. In fact, and the other thing that the direction that Peacock pointed me was towards Nagarjuna, who I have just, and Nagarjuna, I guess, really did the final job for me in unpacking the notion of emptiness and anatta.
Right.
And what that's all left me with is a Dharma practice is pretty much non-metaphysical. Pretty much my job is to try to watch as they arise, the impulses which lead and which create, which are dukkha. And beyond that, the conceptual gymnastics, the metaphysical kinds of constructs just are not as relevant to me. And so I guess Nagarjuna was just unbelievable, because for somebody like me who tends to be pretty cerebral. The other thing that Peacock pointed out was that in the that he regards metta and the paths of the heart as full-fledged paths to awakening, not second-class paths. And he finds evidence in the canon, and just by reading the Metta Sutta actually is all it takes. And so, and I guess there's a Rilke poem it's not enough to understand, to know what's going on, you have to love what's going on, because that's the quality of your experience, is the quality of your heart. So that's where my practice has come to now. It's a practice of, it feels pretty balanced. And the day long that I did, I guess, a couple of weeks ago, was I guess it was titled Towards a Secular Buddhism. And I'm not a real fan of the phrase. I wish we had something different, but it would be a little bit, you can't really just call it real Buddhism.
Right. Yeah.
But it's got a negative quality to it. It's not spiritual. It's not religious, and I'm not sure what spirit is, and certainly the Buddhist path doesn't feel religious to me. But it's sort of whatever the opposite of secular is. It's not that.
Yeah, that's come up a bit, that the use of naturalism is cropping up a little bit more, and I've been encouraging this because it doesn't have the religious aversive connotations that secular may have in some contexts. And one example I have here, and we for folks listening to the podcast, I do plan on doing an interview with this author, Owen Flanagan. His new book, The Bodhisattva's Brain, his subtitle on that is Buddhism Naturalized. And it's along these...
Well, that's certainly how I feel, yeah. Because the Buddha's insight is not dependent on the cultural context.
Right.
And so we should be able to import it completely in terms of our own cultural skepticisms and scientific understandings and objectivity standards, that because it doesn't really affect that. I think of the Buddha sort of as a docent, maybe more explicitly, sort of like a realtor. A realtor takes you to the house and says, here, look at the granite countertops, and there are the solar panels on the roof, and look at the nice roof. But you're the one who's expected to look. And so in the end, the Buddhist path is for us individually.
Well, and it's such a compelling point that Buddhism and this practice and this realization, if it's just for people who take on Buddhism, then we failed. Then it's not a true statement. If this practice and what it actually does for you, it doesn't apply to people of other faiths or non-theists, then there's a problem at the outset.
Well, I think there's a problem because those kinds of faiths imply view, and clinging to views is one of the kinds of clinging, and it's actually one of the basic one of the asavas, one of the basic defilements.
Yeah.
It's built in. I think and I think a lot of the problem we have is with the hardware that we're born with. And I think the effort to use our brains conceptually as tools for survival and navigating and functioning in the world leads us to believe what we think. And clinging to views, the Buddha warned us, I guess, to hold them provisionally at least. And so any of those metaphysical constructs just really are beside the point.
Right.
For me.
I agree.
This is just my take.
Yeah, it's not something that we can show. It's not that. It's an equally dogmatic stance to deny something that's not an evidence, because absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Right.
At the same time, if you can't show it, we really can't say that it is true either. So both of these really need to be set aside. And the dependency of I would say the core distinguishing characteristic of a secular Buddhist practice is that the practice is only dependent on things in the natural world for which that we can show, for which there is evidence. That there may be things that are not in evidence, and that's fine. You could still hold those beliefs if you find them uplifting and so on. That's fine. It's just your practice, what you do, is not dependent on them. You can continue to practice without that just as well.
Well, I sort of, I'm not sure that the Buddha never made a reality claim, but I don't treat his teachings as if they are reality claims. I treat them as if they're pointing in a particular direction for us to look, so that we're practicing with. I like the phrase which I read somewhere, may have been on your site, with a roadmap, so that we have a clue. So what he points at, he says, I teach. Is it two things or one thing? I teach suffering and the end of suffering.
And the extinguishing of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Is that two things or one thing?
I've
can't
heard it
remember.
both ways, actually. The one that
Yeah.
I've heard most often is I teach one thing only, suffering and the extinguishing of it, and that
And I think he had one insight, one big insight into the nature of dukkha.
he didn't say I teach two things. One of them is
Yeah.
suffering in its nature, and the other is that Mount Sumeru is the middle of the universe. No, that
Yeah.
that wasn't
Yeah. He
part of it.
didn't.
He
He
wasn't
left
making
that
claims
stuff
about the
out.
natural world, right?
He left that stuff out. But it's Four Noble Truths, which are really just four refractions on one insight. It seems to me, because if you understood, and this is my take, but don't you think if you understood dukkha completely and recognized it as even the first impulse arose, the causes and conditions that gave rise to it, just a second truth, you'd certainly know your way to abandon it, and it's worse for yourself and others, which is the third truth. You'd probably find yourself living the way of the eightfold way. So I think it's one insight into the nature of things.
And it's an experiential kind of knowing.
It is, and so the Buddhist teachings are pointing at that, and it doesn't matter whether you believe in Darwin or don't believe in Darwin. Personally, I sort of think Darwin was a bright guy, you know, and boy, our science certainly has been able to do a lot of things based on that, but it's not what the Dharma is. It's not what the Buddha is talking about.
It's not intended to describe our existential moment by moment way of interacting with that biological, naturally evolved life.
Yeah, so I decided to I did a day long on secular Buddhism a couple of weeks ago, which is how you noticed me, I guess, and you know, I wanted to in order to work with a Buddhism that doesn't import propositions that I don't believe, like, you know, I don't disbelieve the notion of multiple lifetimes. I don't have any experience myself, and so I teach from my own experience. So I don't. You know, what happens to the Dharma? What happens to theories of karma? What happens to when you abandon that? And you know, it changes. It pushed me looking towards, okay, what do we mean by what is this? What's karma? What's the role of karma? Certainly, it was a big deal for the Buddha. He said it's intention, which is the second element on the path. And you know, I've sort of come to the conclusion, and so I'm giving you the conclusion without the way I worked to it. But you know, it's karma is about what you make yourself into, not what happens to you. It's not about your fate. You know, the Buddha says, you know, what you spend your time thinking about, that becomes the inclination of the mind. And if you, and you know, your karma are the habits that you cultivate over time. You know, so all precept practice becomes about intention. It's not about the rules of good and bad, and they're not 5 commandments. Although people, you know, I've heard senior teachers say you should never lie under any circumstances. You know, I mean, you got to if it's but the truth can be hurtful at times. And so rather than, you know, the Nazis knock on the door and say, "Is Anne Frank here?" You don't say,
"Right upstairs, right this way."
Yeah, behind the fake bookcase. You know, so the precepts are contextual. They're markers. They're tools for inquiry, and it changed my relationship, my understanding of the Buddhist teachings, and so I just I teach that in my group. That's the kind of the stuff we do and talk about in my group in Davis, and people around who ask me about, that's sort of what I teach. And I thought when I was asked to do a day-long, I thought, well, that sounds like that's where my practice is right now. It's where my thinking is. So that's how it came out.
Now, when you did the day-long, how did people respond to that? You mentioned before we started the interview some responses that you'd heard changed a little bit from how they had started when the day began.
Well, I thought it went swimmingly, and the way I could tell was there were the same number of people there after lunch as there were in the morning.
A sure sign, yes.
Well, at least they didn't go out and say, well, we can go back or we can go shopping, and decide that shopping was better, or whatever it is that they might have done. So I thought it went pretty well, and there was a fairly robust conversation. Mostly inquiring. I wasn't challenged much, and I felt pretty good about it at the end.
Now, you'd heard though that it from some others that it might not have. There may have been. I think it was a little bristling.
Somebody said that there was a little bristling at first, but I didn't notice it, and apparently it didn't drive. It wasn't enough to drive anybody away. I think people, the teaching comes packaged in a lot of Asian metaphysics, and when you suggest that maybe it doesn't need that, some people cringe. Now, on the other hand, I do think that the teachings need some framework, because if you just say, well, there's some poets who point in the same direction, that's fine, but it doesn't help anybody which poets and why, and so I think the structure of the Buddhist teachings is very helpful in pointing in the direction where practice ought to go. Otherwise, you're just sort of drifting. Or you could be the Buddha and do it all yourself.
For those of us who are fully enlightened beings, or if you are a fully enlightened being, let us know how that's going.
Well, a fully enlightened being, I'm not sure.
What would that look like? How could you tell?
Well, first of all, there are no beings. Beings are concepts. Beings are empty and dependent on their conditions and arise. So what are we talking about when we talk about something that's fully enlightened? I don't think of enlightenment as like a big bang. It's not you touch the third rail and all of a sudden you light right up. You get that nirvana unconditioned, the taste of that. And
you're done. Everything is no remainder, fully extinguished. Everything's hunky dory from now on out.
Yeah, blissful. Jack Kornfield's book is After the Ecstasy of the Laundry. I mean,
yeah.
We've got we got to live with our life. We've got to live. How are we going to live day to day? And the facts of life are that things will be unpleasant. Old age, sickness, and death is on our dance cards, one way or the other. The good things are going to pass, and the bad things are going to come. And so accommodating that, those are the Buddha talked about three kinds of dukkha, and those are the first two. And the third is the one that we make, by thinking it should be different. So we've got to live in the world with unpleasantness, and and figuring out how to do that is the task, it seems to me.
So, Tony, are you thinking about maybe doing some more of these day-longs or some other retreats or other talks on this notion that the underlying teaching may not necessarily need the cultural baggage that's come along with it?
Well, I'm not really promoting myself as a teacher. People ask me to come and teach, and when they ask, I'm happy to go and share my vision. but I'm not looking to try to, so I don't have any plans. Let me just put it that way.
Okay.
It's the kind of stuff I have a Monday night group that I meet with. I don't know, 15, 20 people who come and go, and this is what we talk about. And it's not, I practice with them, and I'm very fond of them, and there's an incredible amount of wisdom in the group, and so that's sort of where we're working.
Yeah. Kalyanamitas, your friends on the path.
Yeah, well, it's a open group, but it's it's not. We don't do introductory classes and stuff like that.
Well, we've been speaking with Tony Bernhard, and for those of you who are interested in hearing some more of what Tony has to say, he does have talks out on dharmaseed.org, and I'll have a link directly to those on the webpage for this episode. Tony, thank you very much for being here. I've appreciated the talk.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at www.secularbuddhistassociation.com, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaisa Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.